Welcome to the Inversion. This time, as part of the Inversion, I would like to speak about spiritual control mechanisms and how they may be used for trauma or splintering the integrated mind. In chapter 5 of my book, The Inversion, I call it Unidentified Spectres, Spiritual Control Mechanisms as Trauma. Because human consciousness has always been targeted from way back in human history. Then it was more targeted through external means, controlling the environment, threats, physical torture, through the authority, whether it's the ruling authority, whether it's religion, or then the sovereign state, having control or some type of authority over the human body as the human subject. But over time, that's become more internalized, and so the system, quite literally, is getting into our heads. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, looking at my book, because we may not realize that there is a control mechanism for human consciousness. And for a long time, it's been controlled through mythology as well. And a lot of narratives that come into our society, they are religious narratives, then there were scientific narratives. But overall, there are these great overarching mythological narratives, which are shaping our worldview and shaping our perspectives. And of course, then shaping our thought patterns. So in this particular chapter, I want to look specifically at unidentified spectres, the paranormal, those elements or aspects which appear beyond the fringes of our consensus reality. But of course, consensus reality, in a way, is an agreed conspiracy. Just because everybody agrees to it doesn't mean it's not a conspiracy. Just because most people are going in the wrong direction doesn't make it the right direction. So you see, if we agree or are compelled to agree upon a consensus reality, then we're all part of the conspiracy, unwittingly, perhaps. I want to start off by looking at a quote from Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée is a very well-known researcher in the UFO field, way back since the 70s. And he's, not just the UFO field, but paranormal aspects in general. And here's the quote which I use. I propose the hypothesis that there is a control system for human consciousness. Human life is ruled by imagination and myth. They obey strict laws, and they too are governed by control systems. What could paranormal phenomena control? I suggest that it is human belief that is being controlled and conditioned. So paranormal phenomena is one aspect within the whole, I suppose, the whole cauldron, the whole mix that can be used as a controlling, conditioning factor, which I refer to as socio-spiritual engineering. And recently, of course, although the UFO phenomena has been in the public domain, talked about, discussed specifically since the 1940s onwards in the popular domain. It's only really in the last few years that it's really taken an acceleration. And why is that? And I think one thing about paranormal phenomena is that it creates this psychological state which has been known as deferred closure. It means that there are certain aspects of this shared consensus reality that we can't quite figure out. It goes beyond our normal ken of understanding, our normal scope, or beyond our spectrum of what we can kind of fit in. So it's an anomaly. And so we cannot really find a solution for it. And so psychologically, that's referred to as deferred closure. We cannot sign off on it. it's still an unknown. We cannot bring it into our kind of comfort zone of what is the known. So that deferred closure kind of keeps the mind open, keeps a space. So it's open, or we could say vulnerable, to conditioning, programming, impetus. Because, of course, it's not sealed. And I think paranormal phenomena, how it's played with in the propaganda and the media, keeps these kind of openings or fractures available to enter human psychology. So I'm just kind of like giving a brief overview of this subject that I look at. And I refer to it also as a kind of form of psychic hacking, because these cultural engineered events can be seen as being like rituals. And we may not realize that a lot of events or happenings that we see across the world, especially the large events, especially when they get a lot of cross-cultural media attention, and we've seen these very much so in the last, the last 25 years, especially the beginning of this millennium, because of the global media, then we can consider those as rituals, televised rituals, and people can be almost traumatized by those rituals. So, and I say here in chapter 5, the inversion is a heavily manipulated environment where psychic hacking through ritual and cultural engineered events exerts a metaphysical uncertainty and imbalance within many unsuspecting people. A metaphysical uncertainty. We are aware that there's events beyond the physical domain, but we can't pin them down, and so that uncertainty gets played upon. One of the realms where it gets played upon most is, of course, in the entertainment industry, most famously through Hollywood and the controlled media entertainment industry. So really, when people talk about the military-industrial complex, they also now need to expand it to the military-industrial media technological complex. So through all these media and films and TV shows and all these documentaries about paranormal subjects, they're keeping open and they're exploiting this area of metaphysical uncertainty, which again plays into deferred closure. We keep guessing. We're not allowed to understand something completely. It keeps those fractures in the human psyche open for continual intervention. And recently, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of activity from let's say the mainstream media and from the mainstream authorities, from the so-called governments, etc., about this UFO issue, this paranormal. In fact, they've also tried to twist the narrative, to play with it even more, going from changing UFO to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. So again, they're trying to control the narrative by rebranding it. But also what they're doing is just causing great uncertainty. Is it a UFO? Is it a UAP? And they're throwing out more stuff into this realm of metaphysical uncertainty, this realm of deferred closure. And then recently, such like in America, with the Pentagon coming out and showing videos and saying, yes, we do have videos of these unidentified objects, and they're admitting it. And then you get whistleblowers coming out from the military saying, yes, I've heard about these existence of these so-called bodies of other terrestrial species on spacecraft. Even people from NASA coming out saying, yes, we now we can recognize that there's other life out there. I mean, the narrative is still infantilized, still played with on an infantile level. When you get the so-called top scientists coming out saying, we think there could be life out there. And they want people to go, life out there. Well, I mean, because we've been conditioned to think that we are the only pinpoint of life in the whole existence of greater reality, then, what really is an infantile subject gets heightened to this dramatic exposure. And I think that what's been happening with these authorities now coming out and saying, yes, we do think these things exist, that they're creating a kind of contradictory subliminal technique. And that, of course, is that a lot of these paranormal subjects, because we cannot make a closure, because they're deferred closure, we cannot deal with them in our outer everyday consciousness. There's very few people who walk around every day thinking about paranormal and UFOs and these things, because it interferes with our everyday practicalities. So a lot of this gets pushed back into the subconscious. And therefore, if it's in the subconscious, the messages it receives are often from subliminal messages. They bypass the conscious mind because these aspects are not in our forefront of our consciousness. They're in our subconsciousness, so they can receive subliminal messages, bypassing the filters of the conscious mind. So then if we get these messages, we think, oh, the Pentagon is saying this, okay, yeah. Well, but these messages are being received subliminally, and it's contradictory, because over the years they've denied these so strongly. They've tried to so-called persecute whistleblowers in the past about this, and now they're parading whistleblowers in Congress, and they're almost celebrating whistleblowers. They're becoming celebrities, of course. But that's interesting, isn't it? Because they are permitted celebrities, permitted whistleblowers. Now, do they bring out Julian Assange or Edward Snowden and give them an airtime in Congress and let them talk about their experiences? We know what is happening to the genuine whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. So when they bring a whistleblower out and they give them airtime and give them interviews on top programs and they bring them into Congress, that's not a whistleblower. That's a psychological operation. And so it's a subliminal contradictory technique. So now we don't know where we are. The metaphysical uncertainty has expanded into greater uncertainty. And so I talk about this also about how, in a sense, we are living within a traumatized reality. And there's this psychological fracturing, but we may not be consciously aware of it, but our subconscious is aware of it. I mean, trauma has been incorporated into human society, whether we are, consciously aware of it or not. Think about, for example, medical birthing procedures. How often we come dragged into the world or cut out into the world, or pincer pulled into the world. We have all through our society, especially now in so-called industrialized societies, we have continuous random acts of violence. And we're seeing it increasing and increasing in these years. Just absurd violence, not rational, deeply disturbing forms of violence as well. We have institutionalized madness. Institutionalized madness accepted on the world stage. Sociopathic madness parading as authority figures. And of course, then these authority figures put out and support kind of authoritarian fear strategies, especially so in the last few years also. Forms of media, political indoctrinations, religious cult programming, conditioned education, bizarre forms of programming conditioning coming through our culture industries and the music industry especially. These are all kind of ritualized forms of trauma which have been incorporated into what I refer to also in a chapter here, the normalized madness of human life. Interestingly, the Jungian psychoanalyst Donald Kalsched, who I quote here in the book, he notes that the word demonic comes from daimai, which means to divide, and it originally referred to moments of divided consciousness. And it's interesting also that Jung talked about disassociation, how a lot of human aspects of human life creates this this form of disassociation, a divided consciousness again. So, according to Donald Kalsched, we are creating our own demons, DMI, divided consciousness. And from this divided consciousness, we then project our fractured, splintered aspects of our consciousness, which then projects into our human reality, which then feeds into this form of integrated trauma or normalized madness. I read from a quote from Donald Kalsched, the psychoanalyst. He says, quote, "The full pathological effect of trauma requires an outer event and a psychological factor. Outer trauma alone doesn't split the psyche. An inner psychological agency occasioned by the trauma does the splitting." So it's not just outer events that are required as part of this disassociation, but we need a psychological factor, an inner factor, and perhaps paranormal phenomena is able to get into our heads. And through this kind of subliminal contradictory technique of what we're seeing or what we're shown and what we're being told and the different variations of the story we're being told, adds to this kind of disassociation, and therefore we're being disallowed psychic integration. We're being prevented from psychic integration. And that disassociation makes humans more susceptible to the programming, to interventions, because we're not integrated, we're not whole, and therefore more impacts and influences and programming are allowed to come in through the gaps. And just to finish with a quote from Jason Horsley, another writer in this area, he says, "Intelligence black ops that simulate alien abduction, just as Hollywood dramatizations do on a more open and wide scale level, may be a way to shape and direct the narrative in order to control the ways in which we experience these fragmentary psychic forces." So all these aspects, military, authoritarian behavior, along with Hollywood dramatizations and the media inputs, they are shaping the narrative in how we then kind of process and experience these fragmentary psychic forces. So this is all part of the inversion. And what I discuss in my book, The Inversion, is that this lesser reality that we're in is kind of topsy-turvy because we are not permitted to have psychic integration. And as I go on to explain further in the book, and also in my further talks that I give, it's this inner world that we need to have integrated. Because if we give an outer event, which is, let's say, disassociative, if we don't have the inner psychological factor to combine with it, then we're not affecting the same way. We don't process it. So inner stability is what we need to start to perceive through the kind of machinations and the techniques and strategies that are being used in the inversion. So I say that's an extract, or that's a part of what I talk about in the first part of the inversion. The inversion, how we've been tricked into perceiving a false reality. So let us stay psychologically and psychically integrated. Okay. Thanks for listening.